Have you ever found yourself entering a town or a city, a government building or a church building, and been utterly demolished in spirit by the atrocities implemented by postmodern architects in the shape, form, and general aesthetics of the buildings that surround you? The unrelenting and soul-robbing obsession of our society with function before form, the fascination of our culture with ugliness, and the desire to remove itself from the traditional ideals of beauty that tie us to a greater cultural context, to cut the roots we have to a deep and rich heritable well of beauty, aesthetics, and the pursuit of virtue that we can and most certainly should draw from. The incessant deconstruction of Western ideas that has left us with buildings that look as if they were constructed by a 4-year-old child using giant building blocks, art that looks like my 2-year-old son finger-painted it, music that could have been assembled by a caveman beating on a cave wall, lyricism that is more inspired by sexual and guttural barbaric instinct than it is by beauty, and blockbuster films that more often than not pander to this cultural desolation with empty character portrayals like the strong female lead and storylines that leave us all feeling generally ripped off. There seems to be an exchange in all of this, a trade our society is offering to us daily to exchange beauty for mediocrity in the name of progress in postmodernist deconstruction. But my question is, what does all this ugliness inspire in us, and how does it affect our spirit or the way we think? What happens when we remove ourselves from the cultural foundation we all stand upon? Is an anti-culture a culture at all? As C.S. Lewis says in The Abolition of Man, you cannot go on seeing through things forever. The whole point of seeing through something is to see something through it. It is good that the window should be transparent because the street or garden beyond it is opaque. How if you saw through the garden too? It is no use trying to see through first principles. If you see through everything, then everything is transparent. But a wholly transparent world is an invisible world. To see through all things is the same as not to see. So where and when exactly did all this start, and where is it headed? To dig into this problem a little more, I think it would be beneficial to explain a bit more about the context of postmodernism and its connections to modernism. Also, before I get into this more, I should note that both modernism and postmodernism are extremely complex subjects, and many times the writers that are generally associated with both of these concepts express opposing stances or conceptions in their writings, making it extremely difficult to say concretely what the adherents to these concepts believe. So in making this video, it is impossible for me to make all of the necessary considerations to differentiate all of the complex details of these ideas. I am only attempting here to present a general and broad overview of these concepts and explain exactly how they impacted the aesthetics of our current world. And even so, I would encourage whoever is listening to take the time to learn more about these things and not rely solely on my short contextual video about postmodern aesthetics. Hopefully, if I get the time, I can do a deeper dive into the complexity of both modernism and postmodernism, but for now, I am only attempting to set a context to better understand our current dilemma with postmodern aesthetics. Not necessarily the way that these concepts affect our ideas about truth, morality, and virtue. I might touch on those things, but it is not my purpose with this video. I am only setting a context here. If you guys are interested in me doing a deep dive into this subject in the future, let me know in the comments. So, modernism takes place in the post-industrial era at the turn of the 19th century and comes to an end with the beginning of the postmodern movement in the latter half of the 20th century. It is an era that was marked by a few determining qualities. Firstly, it was primarily reflecting the cultural, philosophical, and technological time with which it was a part of. The post-Enlightenment world saw a pathway of progress to an ever-bright future, enabled by the industrialization of society, which would provide for the needs of the many in a way previously unimagined. It promised a new future that set itself apart from its traditional past, with the combination of mass production, a capitalist engine, and the invention of new technologies ticking along as never before. Modernism was a movement that inevitably sought to make the world a brand new place, questioning its inherited past and seeking something as original, fresh, and new as the technological world that was taking shape around itself. It was ultimately an idealistic time where artists looked to break free of traditional or classic forms and make something new, while still drawing upon the rich cultural well of past achievements within the Western world. To better understand this, if we look at the art world and consider someone like Picasso, arguably the quintessential modernist painter, through movements such as Cubism, he seems to be unraveling the ties to the past, questioning the artistic inheritance of the West, and making something new out of it while still being informed by his classical Western training. This can also be seen in a writer like T.S. Eliot, whose famous poem, The Wasteland, references a large number of great works throughout the Western canon, and creates from these broken shards or fragments a sort of modern collage of a culture in crisis. Dadaism took that even farther, arguably laying the true root of postmodernism by asking the question of what art actually is, exemplified by Marcel Duchamp in 1917 with his famed Urinal that shocked the art world, which was more of a statement about the subjectivity of art than anything else, and was the beginning of a deconstruction process that would become one of the main markers of postmodernism. It questioned the standard of beauty and art that had been previously inherited by the Western tradition, and placed a focal point not on the aesthetics of the art itself, but on a deconstructive process that questioned the presupposed ideas of Western culture. Because of this, I see Duchamp and Tristan Tzara and the Dadaists in general as big players in the movement that would show up nearly 30 to 40 years later. I guess you could say that these guys were the harbingers of postmodernism.
Every page must explode, whether through seriousness, profundity, nausea, annihilating nonsense, or the way it is printed. Art must be unaesthetic in the extreme, useless and impossible to justify.
I write a manifesto and I want nothing. Yet I say certain things, and in principle I'm against manifestos, as I'm also against principles. The principle, love thy neighbor, is an hypocrisy. Know thyself is utopian but more acceptable, since it embraces wickedness. No pity. Even after this carnage, we still retain the hope of a purified mankind. I speak only for myself, since I do not wish to convince. I have no right to drag others into my river. I am against action. For continuous contradiction, for affirmation too, I am neither for nor against. And I do not explain because I hate common sense. Some people think they can explain rationally, by thought, what they think. But that is extremely relative. Psychoanalysis is a dangerous disease. It puts to sleep the anti-objective impulses of man and systematizes the bourgeoisie. The dialectic is an amusing mechanism which guides us in a banal kind of a way to the opinions we had in the first place.
I wish to start with modernism because it is from the hangover of these idealistic post-Enlightenment ideas that postmodernism first presents itself. The idealistic prospect of progress seemed to come crashing down in the wake of two brutal world wars, and following their unprecedented brutality and harshness brought about by modern man's formative technological powers in the creation of weapons of mass destruction in war, people unsurprisingly came to question all the idealism of the post-Enlightenment thinkers, believing it to be mostly naive and wishful thinking. You see, modernists still held on to certain ideas of meaning and purpose inherited from the previous Western world that informed what they did. The postmodernists, however, for the most part, rejected a certainty or stability of meaning, feeling that meaning was ultimately relative and erected as a social construct by those in power. They questioned cultural narratives, historical narratives, and our inherited moral standards. They reacted to traditional power structures and institutions as oppressing, and through critical theory began to view history as a game of cat and mouse, or oppressor and victim. Arguably, you could say that postmodernism, in a way, was the fulfillment of several modernist ideas. It took the seeds laid in the thought of the post-Enlightenment world and brought them into full bloom in postmodernism. By questioning traditional narratives and taking a relativist stance on ideas about beauty, goodness, and truth, postmodernism shook up the world in several ways that are still working themselves out in our current society. If beauty is entirely subjective, then who's to say that a toilet or a cross pickled in urine is not better or more beautiful than the works of Da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael, or Rembrandt? This is the argument that postmodernism presents to us. Many postmodernists seem to deny that an objective reality exists at all, which has ramifications on how they view everything else, meaning, purpose, truth, morality, goodness, beauty, etc. These all become plastic concepts that are moldable in the postmodern world. If meaning does not exist in a clearly objective way, we can construct meaning ourselves and determine what that means for each one of us individually. The only way for this to work, though, is if we deny our culturally inherited past, which postulated objective truths that existed outside of ourselves that provided meaning and purpose to mankind, God and Christian morality in the Western tradition. What paved the way to the high forms of Western achievements that are exemplified in the paintings of the greatest artists of the Western world, in Caravaggio, in Michelangelo, and Raphael, and Da Vinci, and Rembrandt, in the greatest musical achievements of Hildegard von Bingen, of Johann Sebastian Bach, in the greatest architectural achievements like the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, the Pantheon in Rome, St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow, the Parthenon in Greece, and one of my personal favorites, the Neuschwanstein Castle in Bavaria, Germany. I'm not sure if I said that correctly. If you begin to look, you will likely see a very sharp divide between the art and aesthetics of the modern world with its modern and postmodern stylings as compared to the great and elaborate accomplishments I just mentioned. This is not an accident. The buildings and the aesthetics that surround us explain a lot about our cultural perspective and philosophy. Most people don't think too much about it, but these things have a massive impact on our minds. They are the natural result of the formation of ideas that has taken place over the last few hundreds of years, and we now find ourselves in the middle of it, usually without much thought about it. Let's listen to a composition by Bach, for example. And compare it to whatever Yoko Ono is doing here. Or how about John Cage's silence? Awkward. I think deep down we all know that this is a false promise offered to us by postmodernism. That despite what these buildings tell us, or what the pop music on the radio tells us, or what terrible TV and movies tell us, there is a purpose that exists outside of what each one of us constructs, that beauty matters. And the way I think we can combat this is by acting like it does, by appreciating past achievements that are truly great, that reflect thousands of years of cultural accumulation before they presented themselves, and ultimately reflect a worldview that places God, beauty, goodness, and truth at the center of its understanding about culture and artistic forms. There is a concept in a book by Philip Rieff, My Life Among the Deathworks, that I think is helpful to understand what is going on here with the postmodernist attack on the previous culture, or the sacred. The idea is that there are three worlds of Western culture. First world cultures are the cultures that constructed their moral order out of the idea of fate, or a vaguer notion of the gods. Think ancient Greece and what we see in the writings of Homer and Hesiod, as well as the writers of the Greek tragedies. It is not God as a pure and transcendent standard of goodness who rules with authority, but a force born of chaos, or the void, as we see in Hesiod's creation of the world, that is reflected in nature, that lies beyond men and women in fate. The second world culture then follows from this, a culture where the character of God sets the standard of law and objective morality as it reflects his being. This includes the Christian world and the world of Old Testament Judaism. The first and second world remain in continuity in that they are both based on a sacred order and look to something transcendent that lies beyond the material world. Where they differ, however, is in their idea of divine integrity. So in the second world, something is right or wrong due to its adherence or contradiction to God's character, whereas in the first world, something is right or wrong only in that it is simply commanded to be so arbitrarily by morally questionable gods. It is simply fate outside of one's control, what can be seen famously with Achilles in the Iliad, or Oedipus in Oedipus Rex. The third world, however, is the greatest deviation out of the three. It removes itself completely from the appeal to something transcendent or sacred beyond the material world, to a completely secular form of society, where it looks to base its morality out of the society itself. Reef sees the second world as grounding law, beauty, and truth to something sacred and transcendent, where law has an anchor that makes sense of what is right and wrong, that is informed by a holy authority, by God's character. The third world, however, Reef sees as groundless, looking to make arbitrary rules about what is right and wrong based on whatever it feels correct for the moment, which ultimately makes law incredibly unstable in the third world and continuously moldable and changeable at the whims of whoever is in power, whether that is power by the mob rule of democracy or the rule of the few. The third world looks to itself as the standard. The problem then, and why I brought this up in the first place, is the way it informs our understanding of aesthetics. In a third world culture that looks to cut the root to its sacred past, we find what Reef calls an anti-culture, a culture that effectively attempts to separate itself from a sacred order and a sacred tradition, hoping instead to create a culture from itself. The problem with this is that it is an entirely impossible task. By simply existing, this culture has ties to what came before it. A culture that lays a hatchet to the root of what has come before it will simply die away. The top of the tree cannot survive if it actively cuts away at its trunk. It effectively destroys culture through acts that Reef calls deathworks. These are attempts to tear down the sacred order and wipe out its history. A cross pickled in urine, for example, or explicit pornography as art. These works of art are not beautiful precisely because they lack the sacred and they defile the traditional understanding of art. They are ultimately acts of the destruction of art. They give momentary pleasure to the viewer and artist solely in the shock that they produce. In that way, it is tied to our greater fascination with being constantly entertained. A culture like this that looks to destroy its ties to the past and destroy any intrinsic meaning in what was previously viewed by the West as sacred and beautiful cannot be sustained because it stands against itself. It looks to justify its actions based on itself alone, but it is actively cutting the roots that tie it to a culture. Thus, it is an anti-culture. It is self-destructive. Our modern world looks at beauty through its utilitarian lenses of function and profit. We try to objectify beauty. What is its function? Does it satisfy a desire? This causes consumerism in the modern world to masquerade as art. But beauty is much deeper than that. It does not have a function other than itself. Making it about desire and satiation is stripping it of what it actually is. It is making it into a cheap, meaningless thing that represents no objective truth. What beauty actually is a signpost to God, to truth, to virtue, to goodness. Beauty carries us into the transcendence of the eternal. Beauty feeds man's soul. It takes us out of ourselves and our desires and has us reflect on something greater than ourselves. Roger Scruton says in his slim introduction to aesthetics titled Beauty, "Art moves us because it is beautiful, and it is beautiful in part because it means something. It can be meaningful without being beautiful, but to be beautiful, it must be meaningful." The point of this video is simply to say that beauty matters, so let's start treating it like it does. And with that, I'm gonna wrap up this episode. If you liked it or learned something new, please like and subscribe, share the video with friends. It would be nice to get this out to people. I've included some affiliate links below for further reading on aesthetics if you're interested, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.